Good morning and welcome to our seminar today on the pathway to net zero. My name is Phil Hunter. I'm our Head of Environmental here at Brodie's, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and our speaker here today. Our topic today is setting a pathway to net zero, as I mentioned earlier on. It's one of our series of events and blogs on climate and sustainability, which we're running throughout November and December. You can keep in touch with that on our climate and sustainability page at brodies.com for more content. The reason for the topic is really that I was keen to get under the skin of the practical aspects of climate and sustainability and what it means for organisations. I don't really want to steal Anne's thunder, but what I wanted to cover in it was, or what I wanted to cover, topics I wanted to cover were what net zero means, the sort of basic elements of a net zero strategy, some metrics and measures that could be considered, and some examples of organisations who are already making an impact in reducing carbon emissions. My kind of underlying reason for all of this was to try and put some of the buzzwords that we all hear about these things into a real world context, so that you can understand what this means for you and your organisations, and hopefully we'll achieve that. Moving on, we've got a great speaker today, Anne Johnstone from the Fair Futures Partnership. I'm really delighted that she agreed to accept my invitation to present for us on this topic. Anne's a long-standing friend and colleague of mine. We've worked together on a number of things throughout the years. We've also worked closely together at the UK Environmental Law Association. Anne's a former chair of UKLA and I'm a current vice chair. Telling you a little bit more about Anne. Anne's a very experienced environmental and sustainability consultant, and she was formerly head of environment, energy and sustainability at Hollis. She established the Fair Futures Partnership in July 2020. Anne has experience across a broad range of sectors, specialising particularly in the provision of advice on environment, social and governance and net zero carbon strategies. Anne's also a fellow of the RSA, sits on the governance board of Construction Scotland Innovation Centre, and is a member of the Investment Property Forum Scottish Board. So I'm sure you'll agree she's very well qualified to guide us through the pathway to net zero. So just before I hand over to her, if I can just remind you, if you've got questions to ask, please do ask those in the Q&A, and we'll try and cover as many of those as possible at the end of the session. Without further ado, I will hand over to Anne. Anne. Thanks,
Phil. And thanks everybody for joining us. So we'll just move on to what I'm going to cover in the talk today. So as Phil indicated there, we'll go through what net zero means, why it matters, what the elements of a net zero strategy should be, some of the metrics and measures that should be considered, and some exemplar businesses and organisations that are doing this well. So what is net zero? At its most basic level, net zero carbon means taking the same amount of carbon out of the atmosphere that you put in, either by sequestering it, so by planting trees or restoring peatland, or via technology, so solutions like carbon capture and storage. But when you hear people talk about net zero, generally what they are referring to are targets or strategies that will deliver on the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement was the outcome of COP21, the Conference of the Parties 21 in 2015. It was one single agreement signed by 195 countries and the European Union, that everyone will aim to keep global temperature increases well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels, and to strive to keep to not go above 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're already at 1 degree above pre-industrial levels, so you can see the scale of this challenge. The Paris Agreement allows each country to set its own targets and adopt its own strategies. And it also recognises the role of non-governmental actors in meeting the goal. It's obviously had a little bit of a checkered history, not least that the that Trump took the United States out of the agreement, so they officially withdrew on the 4th of November. But President-elect Biden has committed to rejoin on his first day in office. So COP26, which should have been taking place right now, but so I'm sure we're all aware, has been delayed until next year and is taking place in Glasgow, is the sort of next big, although COP happens every year, effectively every 5 years, there's a sort of major version of the conference, a supercharged version. And that's why COP26 is so important, because that's when the countries will be expected to report on their progress and to present detailed plans to reach net zero by or before 2050. So we'll have a look now at some of the targets that have been set. The UK became the first industrialised nation to enshrine a net zero carbon target in law, setting a target of net zero by 2050 in June 2019. In September 2019, the Scottish Government passed its own legislation, setting a legally binding target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2045 and a 75% reduction by 2030. The First Minister also declared a climate emergency at that point in time. And most recently, the EU published the European Green Deal in December 2019, with the overarching aim of making Europe climate neutral by 2050, with a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. So there's some points to note about these targets. The baseline year that progress is being measured against is 1990. And 1990 was the year that was required by signatories of the Kyoto Protocol to set as their base year. And it was chosen as a common starting point that all countries could commit to. The targets include all greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide, but they don't consider historical carbon dioxide emissions. So to use the bathtub analogy, which is often used in this circumstances, essentially we are turning the tap off before the bath overfills, but we are not emptying the bathtub. The UK's target only covers territorial emissions, so the carbon footprint of imported goods and services is excluded. And with the European deal, Poland has opted out of the targets because of its current heavy reliance on coal and the political implications of that within the country just now. So these targets and the message that they're given are sometimes not all that they seem. So let's take a bit of a closer look at Scotland's target. Scotland has reduced its emissions by 56% compared to 1990 levels already, but almost all of this is due to decarbonisation in the power sector, and other sectors have barely budged at all. The 75% reduction by 2030 has been described by the Committee on Climate Change as extremely stretching and extremely challenging. And they have pointed out that it will require new policies that have to begin to work immediately to deliver reductions in all sectors of the economy, but particularly in buildings, in transport, agriculture, and in land use. But as I mentioned before, delivering the aims of the Paris Agreement is not just the responsibility of governments. Non-state actors also have an important role to play. And this is reflected in a number of voluntary pledges and commitments that have formed in response to the challenge. So there's the UN's own Race to Zero, which mobilises what are called real economy actors outside of national governments to join the Climate Ambition Alliance. And that alliance seeks to go beyond Paris, so cutting greenhouse gas emissions deeper and faster and adopting science-based targets. Signatories to the Race to Zero are required to pledge, to plan, proceed and publish. Building a net zero economy is a collaboration between Anglian Water, Mott MacDonald, Skanska, Transport for London, the UK Collaboration for Research on Infrastructure in Cities, and the UK Green Buildings Council. Transform to Net Zero is a coalition of major corporations, including Unilever, Microsoft, Maersk, Mercedes-Benz, Danone, Nike and Starbucks. The Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance represents the world's largest pension funds and insurers with more than $2.4 trillion in investments. And it also has other signatories, including the UN, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and the Mission 2020 campaign. And the Better Buildings Partnership member commitment has 24 signatories with over 300 billion assets under management and over 12,000 properties in the UK. Part of that commitment is to publish a pathway to net zero by the end of 2020, but so far only one of the signatories, Derwent London, has actually published their pathway. So beyond the legal requirements, let's have a look at some of the other drivers for delivering net zero. The youth climate movement has been massively influential, from a lone protest by Greta Thunberg to a global movement in little over a year, including a massive event that took place in Glasgow in September 2019. It's raised awareness of climate issues generally and influenced governments to be more ambitious in their climate policies. And this has been particularly noticeable in the States, where Joe Biden came in for a lot of criticism during the candidacy, the Democratic candidacy selection, because his climate change policies were not considered to be very ambitious. But they've really ramped them up in terms of what they're now intending to do when they get into government. The youth movement has also been very effective at turning a spotlight on businesses and calling out greenwashing, and that is something that is coming under increasing scrutiny. There's also been lots of surveys published that show the same thing. The number of businesses that are actively trying to become more environmentally responsible is increasing. There's a growing recognition that being environmentally responsible is important to future business success. And although the trend is stronger among younger people and startups, it is happening across the board. That's partly in response to customer demand. You can see here that the majority of businesses are saying that their customers expect them to be taking steps to become more environmentally responsible. But it's also in response to the demands of the workforce. It's increasingly important to show that you're an environmentally and socially responsible business to attract and retain good staff. And it's also importantly in response to the demands of investors, and there's no sign of this diminishing because of the pandemic. So how do you actually go about developing a net zero carbon strategy? To start off, you need to know your carbon footprint. You need to identify the sources of your emissions and then measure them. And those sources generally fall into three categories. And this is another kind of a bit of jargon that I think probably some people, people quite often hear, but might not necessarily be clear about what it means. So basically, scope 1 is anything that's within your direct control. So that's if you've got your own company vehicles or you're paying for mileage reimbursed through expenses. Scope 2 are indirect emissions from electricity and heat purchase. So basically what you pay for through your bills. So that's the footprint of your electricity provider for the electricity that you burn to keep your lights on. And scope 3 is any other indirect emissions. So that's the carbon emissions that come out of things like business travel by air or rail, purchased goods and services, and waste disposal. It's previously been commonplace for strategies only to include scope 1 and scope 2 emissions because scope 3 is difficult to measure by its nature. But this is becoming a lot less acceptable now, and it's also critical to include scope 3 emissions because they can be as much as 5 times more than the direct operational emissions of a business. You need to, once you've decided what's in scope, you need to define a baseline year. It's easiest to align that with a financial year, and it shouldn't really be any further back than 2 years from when you're starting. There's a number of tools available online, excuse me, to calculate carbon footprint, and companies who offer a service to benchmark, verify and offset. And at the end of the presentation, I've included a number of references which includes some of these links, and you can have a look at those there. So all businesses should be doing at least, so once you've done that, you've set you know what your carbon footprint is. To develop your strategy, there are 4 pillars that should be included. Pillar 1, reduce your own emissions. Pillar 2, reduce your value chain emissions. Pillar 3, integrate climate into your own business strategy. And Pillar 4, influence climate action in society. All businesses should be doing at least 1 and 2, but 3 and 4 represent opportunities to actually enhance your existing services or develop new ones, or strengthen your brand. So really, every business should aim to have a strategy that incorporates all 4 of these pillars. So some ways to do that in terms of setting targets. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are very useful for engagement. It gives a clear and obvious framework for discussion. So you can start by considering if your core business activities align with one or more of the goals. You could do that by canvassing staff or your customers or any other significant stakeholders to find out what their priorities are. Again, there are online tools available that can match keywords from your mission statement to the goals. And in some cases, it'll be really obvious. So for example, if you're in the restaurant business, zero hunger might be your target. If you're in teaching, it'd be quality education. But it's not always that straightforward, because for a lot of businesses, they will touch on all, if not most of the goals. So it can actually be quite complicated. I think in that sense, the important thing is to understand what is material to your business and your stakeholders before going and doing the mapping to the SDGs. Another tool that you could look at is the Stirling Protocol, which was developed by a group of authors led by Professor Maggie Cusack at Stirling University, hence the name, which provides a simple framework for decision making at all levels of an organisation. It comprises 3 pillars. Pillars are very popular in sustainability: economy, environment and inclusion. And by challenging decision makers to question their decisions from the perspective of each of these 3 pillars, it aims to put the environment at the heart of inclusive economic decision making. And in terms of net zero, businesses should aim to reduce emissions in line with national targets. So although the first tranche of reductions is the largest one, it's also the easiest one. And as you kind of progress towards 2030, 2040, 2050, whatever it is, the reductions become harder to achieve. So the longer that you leave it to start, the harder and potentially the more expensive it's going to be to adapt. So a successful net zero strategy will be bespoke to your business. However, there are some areas that you can look at where some easy wins are available. So firstly, you don't need to wait until 2030 or 2045 or 2050 to be a net zero carbon business. You can be net zero now if you use offsets. And the question of offsets is often a contentious one, but it really shouldn't be. By offsetting emissions now, you can be contributing towards solutions, and then go on to develop a reduction plan, and over time the level of your offset should be reducing in line with the reductions in your emissions. So where it becomes where it is contentious is where you're only using offsets but not actually doing anything to reduce your carbon footprint. You could switch to 100% renewable energy supply as soon as possible, develop an energy reduction plan, look at things like business travel emissions. I mean, we're all obviously doing these kind of things all the time now. At some point, hopefully in the not too distant future, we will be returning back to offices and returning back to our pre-COVID life in some shape or form. But look at what changes you can keep. Is it really necessary to travel to London for meetings? We've all become much more adept at using technology, and I think we really need to scrutinise what our habits and emissions were before, and whether some of those things can really stay remote so that we are reducing our own personal emissions. If you own buildings, you can look at retrofitting or are tenant in buildings, look at retrofitting and automation. So for example, replacing light fittings with LEDs, introducing infrared sensors so that lights automatically turn on and off when people aren't in the room, introducing things like low flow water fittings on taps and on cisterns. A lot of these things are fairly routine nowadays and not particularly expensive and can be implemented quite easily and lead to some fairly significant savings in cost as well as in carbon. A really effective thing to do is to look at your company pension scheme. So there was a campaign launched a couple of months ago called Make My Money Matter. And according to them, making your pension sustainable can be 27 times more effective at reducing your carbon footprint than giving up flying and becoming vegan combined. And again, it's another thing I think is becoming increasingly important in terms of staff engagement because people are becoming more aware of where their pension is invested. I think, not dealing with this, not being proactive about it runs the risk that, you then have staff coming to you and asking that question of, where is it, what's the company pension scheme invested in? And it can be a bit of an eye-opener when you go and look at it. So when I did this with my own pension, I discovered that I was investing in a FTSE tracker that had 3 oil majors and 2 tobacco companies in it. So I quite swiftly changed that. You can review staff incentives and packages. Can you encourage the behavioural change that's needed to achieve your goals, or actually are you actually encouraging behaviour that is not sustainable through the way that you compensate your staff? But the one thing that I think is really crucial to all of this is to invest in engagement across your whole business. So training, communication regularly, often, meaningfully, and empowering people to kind of come up with their own ideas and take ownership of the net zero strategy themselves. And then once you've sorted out your own emissions, it's time to look at your supply chain. So if we just move on to the next slide. Thanks. Review your supplier code of conduct if you have one. Share your own KPIs and make clear what your commitment is to disclosure and what you expect from your suppliers. Engage with your suppliers, ask to see their net zero strategies and KPIs. Embed sustainability metrics into your procurement decisions so that it is clear that it's not just being driven by cost, but also work collaboratively with your suppliers to make sure that your policies don't exclude small businesses. And this last point is exactly the sort of thing that the Stirling Protocol is designed to do. So just think through measures to make sure that they're just and fair as well as environmentally beneficial. So now I'm going to take a look at some examples. Firstly, a new offsetting scheme called ARC 2030. ARC is a global platform which is aiming to restore 500 million hectares of habitat destroyed since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and invest in companies that will turn back the dial on the climate crisis. It's a collaboration of science, academia, landowners, NGOs and private sector partners. It can be engaged with at a business level or at an individual level. Basically, people collect points which can be swapped for different ARC missions, and those points can be purchased, but they can also be earned or be sponsored or given. So it can be used as an effective tool for engagement. It also functions as a social network, allowing users to connect with each other and share experiences and learn new habits. And it provides brand recognition for those businesses that are promoted by ARC. In the near future, other loyalty points like Tesco Club cards you'll be able to swap those for ARC points on eligible purchases, which is supposed to drive more intentional consumer behaviour. And ARC points will be able to be offered as employee benefits. So, this is one of a number. I think that I'm aware of other similar schemes that are in production development at the moment, where people are being encouraged to engage rather than just making a one-off payment for carbon credits. So I think we will see a lot more of this kind of thing in the near future as well. Okay, so now we'll move on to some business case studies. So first one is Interface, which is a really well-known example. Interface make carpet tiles, which is a fossil fuel intensive business. In the mid-1990s, the founder, Ray Anderson, had what he described as a spear in the chest moment when a customer asked him what he was doing for the environment and he didn't have an immediate answer. So that changed his whole perspective on business and his relationship with sustainability. And he sought out some experts to help him develop what he called his Mission Zero commitment, which was to have zero impact on the environment by 2020. In 2019, Interface announced that it had achieved net zero emissions, and it's now a $1 billion company that sells a range of floor coverings, all of which are carbon neutral across their full life cycle. And I would highly recommend that you read Ray's book, which is called Mid-Course Correction. Ray himself actually died in 2011, but the book was republished last year with a sort of a new introduction, and it is a really good read for anybody who wants to understand how you completely shift a huge company like that, and you know, goes into why he did it. MacArthur Green is a specialist ecological consultancy that's based here in Glasgow. They've developed a carbon negative business model and they are certified as a carbon neutral business. Ensuring their business is carbon negative is fundamental to the way they operate. And they've also published very clear information on the approach that they took on their website in order to encourage other SMEs to adopt a similar approach. So again, I've included a link to that at the end of the presentation. Halo is an urban regeneration project in Kilmarnock. It's a 28-acre brownfield site, the former Johnny Walker bottling plant, and it's been redeveloped as a mixed-use development that's projected to generate over £200 million in GDP and 1,500 jobs. There's been significant community and partner engagement to deliver sustainable long-term economic benefits, and it's aiming to be the first town centre located net zero carbon development in Scotland. Halo is working in partnership with the Construction Scotland Innovation Centre to deliver 210 affordable smart homes. These will be modular units that will be constructed off-site, and they will operate on 100% renewable energy, including heat pumps and batteries. Halo will also include a low carbon transport system, including electric buses, EV charging points, e-bikes and mobility clubs, and education and skills training for local residents and young people will have a heavy focus on the skills required in a low carbon economy. And this has all come about due to the commitment and drive of the Chief Executive, Marie Macklin. Scottish Power became the first integrated energy company in the UK to shift completely from coal and gas generation to wind power after completing the sale of its traditional generation business to Drax in 2018. Their parent company, Iberdrola, has just announced a €75 billion investment plan in renewables before 2025, half of which will be used in the US and the UK. And last week, Scottish Power Renewables achieved what's thought to be a global first by using energy from an onshore wind farm to power a black start, which is a procedure to repower part of the grid that has gone offline. So what all of these companies have in common is that they've made net zero part of their core identity. This simple graph is from a book by author James Clear called Atomic Habits. The basic premise is that to achieve goals, you need to build systems to develop better habits that allow you to make incremental gains over time. So in short, if you identify as a responsible, sustainable business, then you will take actions that support that. So this top level represents your goals. And in some respects, it doesn't matter what these are. James gives an interesting case study about Team Sky in his TED Talk that explains why this is. At the next level are your actions, or what you do to achieve your goals. In the context of your journey to net zero, how do you make sure that these actions are effective? If it doesn't go any deeper than this level, then they probably won't be. And at the heart of it, it's really about your identity. So a shift in mindset equals a shift in daily choices. And ultimately, this has to inform every choice that you make as a business. If it's treated as an add-on or an optional extra, then it'll fail. So to sum up, these are the key points that I'd like you to take away even. Change your mindset. Offset, but do your due diligence on the scheme and aim to reduce your offsets to zero over time. Focus on starting, not where you'll end up. Make a public commitment to your staff, to your customers in the big wide world. Don't feel you need to do everything at once. Identify the actions that have the biggest impact and focus on those first. And share your progress, successes and failures. This is a collective effort and will only succeed if we approach it collaboratively. A few things to look out for over the coming months. In December, the Scottish Government is publishing its climate change plan. This has been delayed from earlier in the year because of COVID. So following on from the programme for government, that should contain some more information about what the policies will be in some of these individual sector areas that I mentioned earlier. Next week, the UK government is announcing a 10-point plan in advance of COP. There was also an announcement this week from the Treasury that TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Related Disclosures, their reporting along those lines will be mandatory for large companies by 2025. We're also still waiting to hear what is going to happen to the EU emissions trading scheme, whether it will be replaced by a UK carbon trading scheme or a carbon emissions tax. That has to come in from the 1st of January, so hopefully an announcement about that is imminent. And with the kind of renewed vigour around COP26, with the news about the US coming back into the Paris Agreement, I would expect a lot more announcements from both the Scottish and the UK governments in the run-up to COP. So that's it. Just got the list of references, which you can have a look at, but I think the slides will be available for circulation, so you'll be able to kind of peruse those at your leisure. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. That was great. There's a lot in there for people, but I think also it gives a practical bent on how you might approach this in your business, which hopefully gives people some pointers. I'm going to invoke a bit of privilege in terms of asking you the first question, then we'll move on to some of the questions that the delegates have asked. First question is, and I think it's quite topical really, is obviously government, both the Scottish Government and the UK Government have talked a lot about the green recovery, and they've both made policy and funding pledges in relation to those sorts of measures. I suppose the question to ask is, and I think that realises that there's, in a way, that we need to tackle these things and that there's a need for action now. I suppose the question in my mind is just really, is that enough, do you think, to kickstart the movement? I mean, we seem to have, there seems to be a bit of a watershed in society, and there's been a lot of talk about from businesses calling for that as well. I mean, do you think there's do you think that is enough to kickstart the process?
I don't think that what actually has been committed is enough. If you look at, so the UK government's fund for green recovery is £5 billion, and compared to I think it's like 32 billion in Germany and 27 billion in France. I don't know if those are exactly the right numbers, but it's on that order of magnitude. So there's a bit of are they really kind of backing up those commitments with the funding? I think arguably they're not. And also some of the projects that they are funding, things like more roads, HS2, which there's clearly concerns there that these things will not will be counter to meeting net zero targets.
The thing that strikes me about it is the opportunity piece, the opportunity for business, the opportunity that it gives us to, I mean, there does seem to be an acknowledgement that we need to address these things, which maybe obviously plans were in place before we hit the global pandemic, which has been horrendous. But as part of building back out of that, or moving forward out of that, is probably better words. I think it's interesting to see that there doesn't seem to be an argument about it. There just seems to be an acknowledgement that this is what we have to do. So I think I see that as being extremely positive in the sense of the doors that it opens for businesses, in the sense of creating jobs and investment moving forward, which seems to me to be a major thing.
I agree with that, and I think if you look at the enormous sums of money that I mentioned in terms of that are covered now by net zero commitments, then the commitment from the financial sector and the investment community is not going away. And I think that there's an interesting parallel there between what happened after after the financial crash and what's happening now. I think a lot of people were concerned that the pandemic and the kind of economic contraction would mean that a lot of these things, people would just kind of say, well, we have to put that, we have to kick that can down the road. We can't focus on that now. But that it doesn't seem to be the case. Certainly not in terms of the private sector. And I think and again looking at pensions, that those things do mean that in terms of the commitment is there for government, but they will, I think, have to be more ambitious. And as the Climate Change Committee have pointed out, we will need to start seeing policies and legislation that are going to significantly drive change, particularly in some parts of the economy, like the built environment and like agriculture.
So a good start, but maybe more work to be done.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll move on to some of the questions that we've been asked. I think the first one's probably actually relatively easy for the answering. Offsetting's a relatively easy win. How do you respond to clients who wish to discuss how you've achieved net zero?
This is, I think, again, as I said, it's contentious and I would expect it to be challenged, but it's not effectively, no one is net zero right now, very few people, but if you are offsetting your emissions, then you are putting a financial contribution towards what those emissions are. If you have a robust plan for reducing your emissions, then there is, and you have done your due diligence on what your offsets are doing, then that, I think, is a convincing commitment to decarbonisation. Where it isn't convincing is if you're just offsetting and not doing anything else, and that that applies at every level, for people as individuals as well as businesses.
So it's a step along the journey, but not necessarily the whole answer.
Yeah.
Okay. A very quick and easy one, I suspect. Is nuclear sourced energy seen as renewable?
It depends who you ask. I mean, I think again, it's part of a transition, and a lot of these things are about our energy mix. But the more interesting question, I think, is about where you're putting money for future energy supply, and what the balance is between nuclear and what nuclear will deliver and renewables. And my view is that certainly in terms of like governments, that the investment should be in renewables.
Yeah. And I think probably also driving a bit of technology in terms of what else might be out there, what else we can do. Because the age-old question has always been one about maintaining the continuity of supply, and that's always been the issue, is the baseline continuing the baseline.
Yeah.
But I think we are now seeing, well, certainly from what I have seen, we're starting to move to a point where people are looking at solutions that start to fill those gaps about being able to provide that balance of sources, and which is kind of interesting to see. It's taking a while to kick off, but
I mean, that's why things like the black start thing with Scottish Power are so interesting. You know, the fact that has been achieved now. I mean, that it sounds relatively straightforward, but it was a massive achievement in terms of you know, technology and collaboration and adjustments to the grid, as well as the actual you know, the power source. So you know, those are, you know, they're not as, I mean, well, I find them quite exciting, but they're probably harder for people to kind of understand than you know, just a very simple, where is the power coming from?
Yeah, I think that takes you back to that thing though about the opportunity that is here. You know, the opportunity to innovate, the opportunity to create businesses that don't exist now, the opportunity to develop, you know, technologies that we don't currently have, and the opportunity for you know, employment in these areas as well, and to create very successful businesses out of these and work streams. Another question, do you think if major companies introduced green leasing, green lease clauses, this would have a significant impact on emissions? Marks and Spencer's, I think, has been the delegates saying Marks and Spencer's are an example of a company already implementing this.
Yes, I do. I think that without cooperation between landlords and tenants, then it's not going to work. And a lot of these things are not just about, you know, either behavioural or technological. They're about things like, you know, what's your contractual arrangement? How do you share risk and reward in terms of investments that are made, and then savings on returns that are generated by those, and you know, quite a lot of our kind of traditional models don't really allow for that, and I think, you know, there's definitely significant gains to be had by parties sitting down and thrashing those things out.
Yeah, I think that's right, and we have seen some moves from the large property owners to look at their portfolios in that kind of a way. I think maybe it's probably fair to say that hasn't hit across the whole market, and partly because of the length of time for which most of these arrangements last. You know, they're a lot of them are long-term arrangements, so you can't click your fingers and completely change the basis on which they run. But I think that there is an active targeting of those. Certainly some of the bigger landlords are already well underway with that, and that's partly because the pension fund money going in and all the factors that they need to look at in terms of where investment goes and how that investment fits with their environment, social and governance priorities as well. Okay. Do you think the changes in working practices and issues caused by COVID around air quality and agile working will kickstart the move to more sustainable buildings, assisting the move to net zero? So I think that's really about the changes in behaviour that we have maybe seen as a result of the pandemic. I mean, I think maybe if we look at that as a sort of a group of, you know, questions, maybe not just related to air, but just there have been a lot of changes in the way that people work. We wouldn't be necessarily be doing this using this technology at the moment. But we're all, you know, we do this day in, day out now. Everybody's very au fait with it. You know, we're all sitting at home. We're not in offices at the moment. You know, how do you think that's going to? Do we think there will be a longer term effect?
Well, I mean, I think for, you know, a lot of people have discovered that, you know, they have a better work-life balance, and they won't really want to give that up. And then, you know, there are other people that this whole thing's been a complete nightmare for, because they weren't set up for that kind of to work from home. But then, you know, that's led to things like a lot of work around things like 20-minute cities or 20-minute towns, where, you know, that they're looking at, you know, can you have more kind of like local neighbourhood working hubs that people can go to rather than all having to come into a city centre. So I think there will be some pretty interesting innovations around that will be driven by, you know, people changing, you know, their perception of you know, what they're willing to, you know, what they want from their job.
Yeah.
But I think the thing about the kind of air quality and I mean, that is an interesting one, because there will now be, I think, an increasing, you know, obviously we've come through a pandemic, or we are in a pandemic, but it might not be, you know, there's this, it's not going to be the last one, so I'm afraid to say. So, you know, people will be much more focused on like what's actually going on in terms of like the health and safety and the internal environment of a building.
Yeah.
And I think there will definitely have to be a much more, you know, if you're a commercial landlord and you're looking to lease you know, a significant space, I think you're going to be asked a lot more, you know, some tougher questions that you wouldn't have been asked previously about things like indoor air quality. And rather than them being niche, they're going to become much more common. And that in itself, I think, will drive other things that will contribute towards net zero.
Yeah, you've got a feeling it'll drive the market to a degree, is the demand for buildings that are of that quality. I mean, clearly not everything can be, you can't necessarily deal with that in some of the older buildings, but the newer building stock, you know, people are looking now towards, you know, the well-being standards and all those sorts of things as well, which is quite an interesting thing. And in terms of attracting and retaining staff, there's obviously a bit of there's a pool there as well, because you know, people are more concerned about the environment in which they're working and living now than maybe they were before. Quite an interesting question here. As businesses work towards net zero, what standard scheme must they adhere to, i.e. Scottish Government, UK, EU? And is that adherence usually accompanied by a voluntary commitment to something like the schemes that you talked about before, the UN Race to Zero BBP transfer to net zero? And sorry, I'm just trying to read the remainder of it. Yeah, and I think it's really surrounded by, is there actually a technical requirement? Are there any parameters which are set?
There's not a single one, but there are a number of benchmarks. So again, if you're talking about in buildings, you know, you have schemes like GRESB. You have BREEAM in use, or other BREEAM codes, and then there's wider things like LEED. The Better Buildings Partnership are about to announce a UK version of NABERS, which is a scheme that's used in Australia. So the short answer is yes, you can use a benchmark to certify yourself as net zero, but there is not a single one that applies everywhere, and they will be different depending on. And then there's things as well like Planet Mark, which are more about a business rather than a property.
Yeah, I was going to say there's quite a lot of building specific ones.
But then things like UNPRI, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the GRI standards, you know, these are all, and SASB, these are all like portfolio or business level schemes or certifications that people can use, and you know, they might be useful, but they might not. You know, my kind of view on that is, if you're only doing it for the certification, then you might end up doing things that aren't actually that impactful. And it's important to understand, again, coming back to this whole idea about it has to be completely embedded in your business and inform every action. And if a certification is important because, for example, it matters to your customers, then, you know, absolutely, then you should do that. But if not, then you can drive better, you know, improving behaviour and put your business on a path to net zero without having to apply a certification.
quite an interesting question, just sort of picking up on our discussion about offsetting earlier on. How do you think offsetting would best be monitored? Would an independent regulator be necessary? So I think just taking it out of the hands of the individuals and saying, you know, trying to put some scheme around it, I think.
I mean, offsetting schemes are audited at the moment, and they're audited financially and for their environmental benefit. And there are a number of certification schemes that you can check whether your offset scheme is, they should be fully transparent about their own audit procedures. And that's what I mean about doing your due diligence around them, kind of making sure that that what you're paying, the money that you're paying into a scheme is actually going to deliver what you're required in terms of carbon credits. There's also an element of kind of timescales, because for example, like planting trees is obviously a really popular one and a really important one. But if you kind of like offset a ton of carbon by planting 10 trees, do you know how long they're going to be there for? Is it commercial forestry and that carbon's locked up for 20 years, or is it replacing what's going to be mature woodland and they're going to be there for 200 years? So it's not, it can get quite complicated, but there are verification schemes out there that make it easier for people to identify reputable offsetting schemes.
Yeah, I think that is one of the things that people have concerns about when you talk about offsetting schemes is it an appropriate use? And I think that's the thing. So, and I think that's when you mentioned earlier on, when in your presentation you were talking about carrying out your due diligence. So for businesses, I think that's a case of due diligencing that in the way that you would any other relationship that you have, and being sure that you were comfortable with who you were dealing with, what they were doing, and what the way in which that funding was being used, and that would influence the decisions that you make, I think. Quite an interesting one actually about pension fund investment. Do you think it's becoming easier to invest with a focus on sustainability without having a negative impact on returns, i.e. are sustainable investments increasingly becoming, I suppose, mainstream?
I think yes, they are, but I still think it's too difficult to do. Just for someone that doesn't have, that if you just want to kind of be putting your money away in your pension scheme, or in your group pension scheme, it's still very difficult, I think, for you to do that on an individual level. If you are in a position where you're more in control of your own pension because you've got your money in a SIP, then you probably, yes, it is getting easier, but that probably, for most people under 40 or at certain salary bands or whatever, that's never really going to be they're not going to exercise that degree of control over their own pension. So in terms of, someone within a business who wants to know that their company pension is being invested ethically, it's definitely more funds now, because there's a difference between funds that are responsibly invested, where you're effectively investing by omission, leaving certain things out, and funds that are specifically targeting returns that are from sustainable businesses. And there's definitely a kind of an explosion of those.
I mean, I think it's interesting. The investment world, of course, is now moved to a position where those considerations are now pretty significant in the context of environmental, social, and governance policies. So actually, in a way, we've seen that movement already in some of the larger funds. People like BlackRock, I suppose, is an example, isn't it, in the sense of their considerations for that. I mean, I don't think they're different to any of the other funds, but I mean, the pension fund investment and private equity investments, of course, in some ways are the leaders of looking at that type of investment to a degree, because they're at the cutting edge of you know, looking at the environmental, social and governance aspects of the investments that they're making, and, you know, investigating that and being able to explain what they're doing, and being held accountable for their actions. So I guess maybe with that it's a question of time.
Yeah.
Just probably, I think, our final question, given the time, possibly slightly controversial, and I'm going to slightly paraphrase this. Does the net zero message send the wrong message to companies, in the sense that they may take ineffective action, as opposed to you know, by relying on offsetting and continuing along the same path that they have done before? I think it's,
yeah, I think we've kind of covered that. I mean, if that's the message that you take from it, then it's the wrong message, because the message should definitely be that you have to reduce your emissions. You know, so there's, you know, there is, like, the whole thing, there is no planet B. You know, we have to get within our, you know, another kind of thinker that I'd recommend on that is Kate Rayworth. You know, like, we have to be within our planetary boundaries, and the use of offsets is a tool that we can be using now at the point on the journey that we're at. And I think, you know, you kind of mentioned this earlier, but it is a journey to net zero, and that is where we have to get to. Yeah, and there will be, I mean, there will be some, I mean, there are obviously some sectors where it will be phenomenally difficult to take that back to a situation where, you know, you're actually at, you know, that zero is maybe a very difficult thing to achieve, if not, in some circumstances, probably impossible, depending on how you look at it. I know there's lots of arguments about that, but it's quite an interesting area. Okay, right. I think we'll probably wrap it up now, because I think that's probably us at about time. But thank you very much, Anne. It's much appreciated. Thank you to all that provided us with the useful questions that we've had. It's been an interesting discussion as well at the end of the seminar. Thank you all to all of those who attended. As I say, there's a bit more information in relation to the programme we're running in November and December on climate and sustainability on the website. So please do visit those pages for further content. And I think that's about us. Thank you, Anne. Much appreciated. Thanks, Phil.